Union. The ITU is an organization that predates the Internet, actually predates the UN by quite a long way. It has roots back in the International Telegraph Convention in 1865. But come a long way since then, from the Lincoln administration to now the Trump administration, and the ITU developed into a major stage for communication policy. It's now the UN body jurisdiction over such things as global spectrum use, satellite communications, and for our purpose today, internet policy. And now what that really means, how far that jurisdiction goes, and how important it really is are matters of continuing debate, and I'm sure we'll hear lots of discussion about that in a moment. The UN body, though, the ITU, is an intergovernmental organization rather than a multi-stakeholder organization like ICANN. And given this, the role of the United States government, as well as other governments, is important to governments among themselves around the world. Perhaps the most relevant example of this in recent months is the reports that there may be discussions to reverse the 2016 IANA transition, and that's a move that would have significant effects on shifting political alliances in such places as the ITU. So to discuss that and much more, we have a panel of distinguished experts here who will share their insights for you. Tell you a little bit about them. First, we have Larry Strickling. Larry was the administrator of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA, from 2009 to 2017. While there, he oversaw much of U.S. internet governance policy, including the transfer of the IANA stewardship functions into private hands. He is now the executive director of the Collaborative Governance Project at the Internet Society. Next to him is Fiona Alexander, who is the associate administrator of the Office of International Affairs at NTIA, where she's been since 2006. During her tenure, she also managed the IANA transition, along with formulation of national telecommunications and information policies that are advocated by the United States around the world. And last is Milton Mueller, who is a professor at the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech, and where he leads the Internet Governance Project, which is also located there at Georgia Tech. And he's the author of many academic writings on internet governance, including his recent book entitled Will the Internet Fragment. And he's been just an omnipresent participant in internet policy debates at the ITU, ICANN, and other forums. So just to get started today, I wonder if we could go down the line, starting with you, Larry, just how you view the ITU and its role in internet governance.
Well, I think we need to step back a little bit from the provocative way you pose the question and maybe parse this out a little bit more. The fact of the matter is that from the beginning of the internet, you've had a debate in the international community among states as to whether or not governments should be the primary architects of policy on the internet or whether it should be left to stakeholders. And that debate has certainly been reflected at the ITU. But I think it's really more important to focus on the actors that we're dealing with. So certainly when you're dealing with and looking at the policies of China and Russia, they very much favor a strong government approach to regulating the internet. You look at the United States and like-minded nations in Europe and in other parts of the world, and from the beginning they have favored a multi-stakeholder approach. Largely the debate for the last many years is focused on the plumbing of the internet, the domain name system, for example, and that's where many of these battles were fought out in terms of whether or not government should control the domain name system as reflected in the work that ICANN does to manage that on a day-to-day basis, or whether the multi-stakeholder community should manage it as it has since ICANN was created in the late 1990s. That debate is not going away, but I think you have seen over the last several years a trend, certainly going through 2016 into 2017, of more and more countries coming over to support the notion that stakeholders should manage the domain name system and the critical infrastructure of the internet. And now the question is, can we maintain that trend? And can we also see governments or countries increasingly supporting multi-stakeholder approaches to dealing with other policy issues as they're reflected in the internet space as well? So it's not so much what the ITU is claiming as an institution and what people who work for the ITU would like. I'm sure they'd like working on internet issues, who wouldn't? But the issue really comes down to the member states of the ITU and their positioning on this and what it is that they would like to see. And again, that's largely reflected by the debate between China, Russia, and other authoritarian nations and the free countries of the West.
Okay, great. you have a different take on that, or are you
Wow, that's a tough question to ask. No, completely agree with what Larry had said in terms of the ITU. I mean, I think it's important to point out the ITU is an important institution for the United States, not just for the government, but for stakeholders with respect to satellite, orbital slot coordination, and frequency spectrum. It is the only place to do that. So that part of the institution is critical for many of our activities. The challenges we have is when other countries have different perspectives and try to use the institution to do things that we don't want to do. And it is really important to understand that the institution is a reflection of the membership. And so I think when people suggest the UN is taking over the internet or the ITU is taking over the internet, the reality is that different parts or members of the ITU would like to use its tools to do certain things. And something that I've been at MTA actually 18 years now, and something that we continue to have dealt with the 18 years that I've been there and expect will continue as different countries have different approaches on how to deal with issues. So I don't think this is going away anytime soon. It's just the level of intensity and what the issue of the day is and what the issue of this new cycle will be.
Well, I interpreted the question not as can the ITU do any good, but as is it about to take over the internet? I think my position is well known on that. I think it's an unfortunate misdirection of our attention to focus on the ITU itself, which is a relatively weak institution of declining importance in the internet world. And I agree with Larry that you have to focus on the state actors around the world. That's the real problem. If all of the world's state actors got together and could agree within the framework of the ITU, they might do some very bad things, possibly even some good things for the internet, but they don't agree. And what I see happening around the world that's a threat to the internet is that states are trying to take over the internet, national states, and not just the typical bad guys that you drive out, China and Russia, but we see what I call a process of alignment or nationalization of what could be and should be global compatibility and a globally free flow of information and services over the internet. So just to give you an example of this nationalization process that maybe hits you home, we have the Federal Communications Commission here proposing to prevent rural telephone companies from buying Chinese equipment simply because it's Chinese, not without any serious documented security problems. And of course, you can find hardliners in China that would advocate precisely the same thing with respect to U.S. equipment and actually U.S. services. They're in a process of sort of nationalizing, in terms of ownership restrictions, the cloud industry there. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We have so many things like that going on with cybersecurity regulations and investment restrictions that my concern is that states will project their rivalry into the internet governance sphere and tear the internet apart.
Okay, so I think the common theme that we heard throughout there was that what the ITU is a function of what its member states are doing. I wonder if, Fiona, you're involved in these sort of policymaking decisions. Do you see the winds of change at the ITU? Like, what's the trend? Are people going more towards more closed or a direction the United States would not prefer, or are things becoming more preferable to the United States?
Well, so I think these issues really always come to a head when we have these big major conferences. So coming up this year in end of October, November, we have the ITU Plenipotentiary Conference, which is a conference that happens every 4 years, where we have the ability to update the Constitution and Convention of the institution, which looks like that big, originally from 1865, with rules of procedure where we still vote by paper ballot. And we elect officials and kind of set the scope of the institution. So this every 4-year cycle, you often will have this what's the purpose of the institution kind of inward reflection process of people. And that's what's going to happen this go-round as well. And as countries around the world continue to have challenges with how they deal with internet policy issues and some of the issues that Milton addressed, but as other countries that would be more favorably inclined for democratic values look to get their people online and try to figure that out. They raise those issues as well. So one common theme that always happens at the ITU is cost sharing, right? How do I get people in my community online, and how do we share those costs? And how do I, as a developing country, not pay all those costs? And historically, that was through telephone accounting rates that were done at the ITU. We've seen proposals over the years to develop internet charging arrangements and schemes for that. And there are definitely proposals that seem to be surfacing on over-the-top OTT services and sometimes cost-sharing mechanism for that. So the proposals for the Plenipotentiary Conference are being developed in each region. Most proposals will come through regional processes, although member states can also submit them separately. So early days, you're seeing early stuff in some of the regional conversations. I think I saw a proposal or a possibility of one from Nigeria the other day about regulating OTT and using the ITU to develop a cost-sharing mechanism, right? So that will have to make its way through their regional group and see if they agree, but stuff like that for sure will be coming our way. And then there's other proposals dealing with countries wanting to be able to monitor their people online and using technical standards at the ITU to do that. So for sure, those kinds of things will be, I predict, start showing up in the fall as proposals become more apparent.
Okay. So Larry, in your interactions, and you and Fiona were both at NTIA during the 2012 World Conference on International, the Wicked, we all call it that. And so what sort of ideas or procedural issues did you see developing at the Wicked, and how might that be concerning for how the ITU operates going forward?
Well, what the Wicked demonstrated for us and for all the people who participated in it was that in the context of this larger debate between the authoritarian countries, which are a fairly small group inside ITU in terms of who's active in making proposals, it's China and Russia and a handful of other countries. And then you have the United States and Europe and countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada. But the battle in these debates has always been the rest of the world, the developing countries from Africa, South America, and Asia, and where do they stand? And so there's been something over the years, a competition for the hearts and minds of the developing world. And what the Wicked, I think, demonstrated was that for the first time there was a very specific, concrete example that perhaps the developing world was kind of trending toward the more authoritarian, or the view of the authoritarian countries for more government control. And I think coming out of that, it was something of a wake-up call for the United States to say, well, how do we respond to this situation? How do we respond to the fact that we don't like the trend we might be seeing? And it's interesting that at the end of the IANA transition, you had roughly 30 countries who had voted for a particular resolution at the Wicked came over and in effect came back in supporting the multi-stakeholder resolution of the IANA transition, which showed that from 2012 until 2016, through the efforts of the State Department and Commerce, NTIA, and others, there had been a tremendous amount of movement from in the developing world back to supporting the multi-stakeholder, more democratic approach to decision-making on the internet. So the Wicked was the wake-up call, but I think what you then saw was 4 years of very concerted strategic effort to bring those countries back more in line with the thinking of the West, and I think it was very successful.
Okay. You said the magic word of the IANA transition, so we have to turn to that now. I wonder if we could go to Fiona first to say, just give us an idea of what is the status of the transition and what should we make of these reports, what Administrator Riddle may or may not have done with his confirmation.
Keep asking me these questions about my current and former boss. Obviously the transition is complete, and NTI continues to serve as the U.S. representative in the GAC and will continue to do so and strongly advocate for U.S. interests. I don't have much more to say about what the future looks like for us on other issues, anything more than David Rettel has already said. People have raised concerns. We'll try to figure out how do we solicit stakeholder views and talk to people about things. But in the interim, we continue to be active at ICANN, supportive of ICANN. In fact, the most recent ICANN meeting that was in Puerto Rico, David Rettel went down and gave a speech and talked about our commitment to the model. So there isn't a lot for me to add to that one.
Okay. Milton, I wonder if I could get your take on what would be sort of the international reaction, maybe perhaps at the ITU or other places, if the U.S. were to attempt to undo the INA transition.
Yes, well, talk about shooting yourself in the foot. If you wanted to fuel another big event that Fiona talked about, you have a plenipot coming up, and any signals that we were trying to reverse the IANA transition and seize unilateral control of certain key aspects of internet coordination through the U.S. government going into that conference would be a catalyst for precisely the kind of reassertion of intergovernmentalism as a way of internet governance. It would show that the U.S. Really acted kind of in bad faith, even though that's not true. It would be construed that way, that we never really meant it. I was just in China, and there are still people there, in the more hardcore parts of the Communist Party who still believe that it was not serious and it didn't mean anything. And if we are going to, try to take it back, the practicalities of that, just ignoring that for a moment, but if there's even a concerted effort coming out of the U.S. government to do that, it would be a full-fledged disaster for the multi-stakeholder model, for ICANN, for the credibility and legitimacy of ICANN, and for the credibility of the U.S. government.
So just to add a footnote to that, there is no possibility of reversing the IANA transition. There's just none. People need to understand that at the time the transition was completed, at the time it was announced, the U.S. government played no operational role in the way the domain name system operated. We simply had one clerical function we performed in terms of reviewing changes to the root zone file and passing them on to VeriSign, who actually did the updates. All that happened operationally as a result of the transition is the United States no longer gets those changes to look at before they're passed on to VeriSign. They go straight from ICANN to VeriSign. The IANA functions contract was little more than a designation by the U.S. government back in the late 1990s to have ICANN perform these functions. And the infrastructure to do all that was based on equipment and software and everything else that was developed by the private community and is housed at ICANN. So it is silliness to talk about the United States somehow taking that back, because there's really nothing to take back. And I mean, people have speculated in terms of what could happen, but the only thing I could possibly see, and we're really getting into the weeds now, is that since all you had that issue here was a contract between the United States and ICANN designating ICANN to perform these functions, I suppose it could be, NTIA could be ordered through legislation to go put that contract out again. And if that were to happen, I'm sure everybody would ignore it, because nobody needs a U.S. designation any longer to perform the functions of keeping the root zone and the rest of the domain name system operating. So it's kind of silliness to talk about it even happening. But it would be a huge public relations mistake to even attempt it for the reasons Milton said. The presence of the IANA functions contract for years was the best argument countries like Russia and China had when they were trying to convince the rest of the world, the developing world, to align with their views about the internet, because they could keep pointing to the United States and say, well, the United States has got this special role here. They run the internet through this IANA functions contract, which was a total misstatement of the reality. But at this point, they don't have that argument anymore. And you know what? In the last 2 years, the internet has run just as well as it ran before. Nobody has missed the fact that the United States no longer checks for that update to a root zone file. It had zero impact on anybody who uses the internet, and we should just get on with things and stop talking about this possibility of somehow reversing that action that was taken in 2016. It's not going to happen.
So we're talking about ICANN a little bit now. I want to see, there is government involvement in ICANN, of course. And so I wonder if someone could compare sort of the role of GAC at ICANN with the ITU, and how maybe government influence has been playing a greater or lesser role at ICANN.
from the beginning of the creation of the Governmental Advisory Committee, I had been comparing it to a mini United Nations nestled inside of ICANN, waiting to infect the rest of it with whatever intergovernmental disease that has infected the United Nations. And to some extent that has come true. To some extent the effect has been moderated. You have a good example of the pernicious effect of Government Advisory Committee with the .Amazon case. The company applied for a top-level domain that reflects their trademark, and 5 or 6 Latin American countries made a symbolic identity politics issue out of it, saying, we own the word Amazon, even though they didn't want to use the TLD, even though it's Amazona in their country and not Amazon, even though I think Amazon offered to put up the funds to get them their own similar top-level domain. It's a very powerful symbolic issue of the sort that we've seen various politicians exploit. But it goes way beyond that. There's all kinds of issues regarding geographic names and so on that you can always count on the GAC to at least demonstrate what internet governance would be like if it were in the ITU. Where was I going with this? I think the point about the GAC now is they have a special bylaw in ICANN's bylaws that says the GAC's advice must be listened to and has to be taken into account. And if ICANN is not to follow that advice, they have to enter into negotiations with the GAC. And ultimately, if they disagree, they have to have, I think, a 60-40 vote of the board to disregard that advice. Now, in some ways, that's a step back. In some ways, that's a step forward. The step forward is that before this reform caused by the transition, there was no definition of advice. So anything the GAC said, even if they had no idea how to accomplish it, possibly could be considered advice, and the ICANN board had to enter into lengthy negotiations if they didn't want to follow advice that maybe not even be practical or feasible. Now, there's a clear definition of advice, and that advice has to have a consensus, literally Quaker consensus, within the GAC. And that limits the impact because you can always get maybe one government to stand up to something that's really stupid. Although maybe Fiona should explain what happened with .Amazon, why the U.S. didn't stand up to that, but I won't put her on the spot.
Maybe Larry should explain that.
Maybe not that specifically, but either of you could talk about the role of the U.S. on the GAC.
Well, let me just respond a little bit to what Milton said. I mean, what he said, I think, was accurate, but maybe still not entirely descriptive of the situation. From the start of the IANA transition, it was a bedrock principle of the United States that the transition could not lead to a situation where governments controlled ICANN or took over ICANN. And as a result, effort was made by the community to develop the bylaw change that Milton's talking about. There was a requirement before the transition that the board had to pay special deference to GAC advice, but the big advance was that GAC advice that triggers this deference now has to be consensus advice. And it's not always unanimity, but it has to be advice to which no party affirmatively objects. So it's roughly the same thing, but it allows people to in effect abstain and without having to vote in favor or indicate support for things. And so that basically means that the only time the board has to go through this process of providing any deference to advice is basically on those things that are coming from a unanimous decision of the GAC and all of its members to move it forward, which means by definition that it would be advice that the United States government presumably supports as well, because otherwise it would have objected to the consensus. So I feel that change by itself went a long way toward addressing the concerns people had that somehow the U.S. stepping out of the IANA functions contract could lead to some sort of a government takeover of ICANN. It just cannot happen because, again, it's the Government Advisory Committee. And again, as Milton said, even when there's consensus advice, the board can reject it. They have to have a higher standard in terms of the percentage of board members who have to vote to ignore it, but they're still allowed to ignore it. So I think it keeps governments in a place where, out of the original design of ICANN, the idea was governments should be able to come in and speak on public policy matters. And the idea is that if it's truly a global public policy matter, then it ought to be a matter on which governments generally have a consensus view. And that's what I think the bylaws are now designed to do, and that's the way it will play out. None of that eliminates the, time that might be wasted or the discussions that might be had on issues. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to actually moving forward on advice, it's I think a very secure system in terms of preventing any kind of government capture of that organization.
You want to do a take on that?
Yeah, so maybe to actually answer the question you had posed at the beginning, the bigger picture question, and it's super easy for those of us that live and breathe and work in ICANN and the ITU to kind of go into the specifics. It's kind of an arcane problem we all suffer from. And I think there's people in the room that don't go to these meetings. So the question was, what's the role of government and how is the role of government participation different in each model? So in the ITU, where it's an intergovernmental venue, in the ITU in particular, you have 3 treaty instruments. Governments decide, right? You might have technical standards developed through private sector parties, but at the end of the day, governments are the decision maker. You may pay as a private sector company to participate in the ITU. You may be allowed in as an academic or civil society member. You can join your country's delegation, but at the end of the day, it is a government that decides. In the ICANN model, it's very different. The construct originally was a version of industry self-regulation through private contracts, where all stakeholders were involved in influencing and making policy. So that included governments. So in the GAC, which I don't disagree, it has its many UN-like conversations going on sometimes, at the end of the day, it produces advice, and it's advice into a process. And that process can accept or reject the view of governments collectively. The view of a single government isn't going to trigger that same kind of conversation as Larry described. Whereas in the broader UN setting, a single government and governments are the deciders of everything. And again, this gets back to, where do you think internet policy is best developed? Is it developed in a regime where governments collectively make all the choices? Or is it better addressed where stakeholders and people that own and operate the infrastructure and the users of the internet make the choices? And at a big picture, that's the difference between the two systems from a government participation perspective.
Fiona mentioned earlier the Plenipotentiary Conference coming up this fall, and sort of some of the things that might be on the table there and what we might expect. Does anyone else want to sort of give their thoughts on what you expect at the Plenipot this fall? What might be on the table? What sorts of concerns or opportunities there are? All right.
I mean, I will.
Yeah.
So there's a couple things that are happening at Plenipot that are going to be very important to us and to the United States government and to NTIA. So we are electing officials, right, into the institution. The ITU has 5 elected officials. They're elected separately. And for the first time in a couple decades, we're running a candidate, right? So we're
the U.S.
The United States is, right? So Doreen Bogdan-Martin, who's a former MTI official who works at the ITU, we're running her to be the director of the development sector. And if she were to get elected, she'd be the first woman in the 153-year history of the ITU to be ever elected. So this is important to us for many reasons. And Doreen is super uniquely qualified in that particular area. So that's going to be happening at Plenipot as well, in addition to sort of the substantive debates and discussions. I talked about earlier, the Plenipot is the governing body of the institution. So there'll be a lot of conversation about reform, governance, budgets, management, membership oversight. And that will be a big bucket of issues for us that will be important, at least as NTIA and as a country. And then we're going to have these policy issues, right, that are going to kind of really depend on what proposals are actually submitted from the different member states. And right now, again, nothing specific has gone in. It's a little bit early, but as the summer unfolds, we would expect to see proposals related to OTT. We would expect to maybe see proposals related to privacy. Who knows? Definitely, we'll see proposals related to cybersecurity and sort of how governments are involved in that system. And those are going to be issues that we deal with as they come and make sure that we have shared approaches with allies and figure out how to deal with them. But those policy issues are, not the main reason for having the conference, but it's the one that gets the most news and people seem to care the most about. But just the administrative part of the conference in terms of electing its leadership is actually critical to us, and in particular the cycle, given that we're running a candidate.
All right, so we can't have an internet governance panel these days, at least, given the recent events that have gone on around the Who Is system. There's been some changes to that made at the ICANN meeting in Puerto Rico.
Maybe there are people here who are not of ICANN-related things. Who is the process by which you can type in a domain name and then you can see a lot of contact information about who the registrant of that domain name is. And since the year 2000, there's been a raging controversy over how this service meshes with data protection laws or privacy concerns, with basically the U.S. government, law enforcement, and trademark owners being very in favor of continued indiscriminate access to this data by anybody who wants it, except for marketers, although they manage to get it anyway. And the privacy advocates and sometimes the registries and registrars wanting a more limited access to that data. Basically, civil society people, such as myself, have been telling ICANN that Who is illegal under many privacy laws for many, many years, but ICANN has basically been able to ignore that. And incidentally, when Larry says that the U.S. government had no role or no power over ICANN other than this root zone change review, it's actually not quite correct. The U.S. has made it very clear through memorandums of understanding and through the affirmation of commitments that they wanted ICANN to maintain the existing Who Has policy, regardless of what the multi-stakeholder community decided. But what's changed now is the GDPR. The GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation coming out of Europe, and in effect, Europe is threatening ICANN or registries and registrars with big fines if they don't comply with the GDPR. And since many of them are multinational or do business in Europe, they really would pretty much have to comply on a global basis if they are afraid of these fines. So ICANN has finally taken the privacy message to heart, and it's trying to reform Who is in line with compliance with the GDPR. Now in Puerto Rico, they've been naming their proposals after various kinds of Italian food. So they started with the pizza, and then it was the calzone proposal, and now I'm not sure what it is. It's maybe lasagna that's fallen on the floor. But essentially, they are proposing in very good ways to restrict the amount of information that is publicly displayed. I'm going to boil this down very simply, and then hopefully in the discussion we can get more into the details. So they are trying to limit quite a bit what is publicly displayed to anybody who requests it. But they're going to set up a tiered access system in which certain accredited people will get access to what is hidden from the general public. And the controversy now centers around the accreditation system. Remarkably, in my mind, it seems like the ICANN org tried to punt the issue of the accreditation system to the GAC. They said to the GAC, you come up with a system. Tell us who a law enforcement officer is, for example. Which is not unreasonable, but in a sense, this is a policy decision that should be made by the multi-stakeholder process. And I think maybe what they're concerned about is that the GDPR goes into effect in May, and the multi-stakeholder process is not going to come up with a complex, globally applicable accreditation system in the space of now a month. And neither is the GAC. The GAC can't do anything in a month. They can't decide, to hold a phone call in a month. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out.
So Fiona, I know NTIA took a different position on the who is situation. Do you want to comment on what that is?
Sure. So I think just to maybe recalibrate things a little bit. So Europe's General Data Protection Regulation is not about the domain name system. It just impacts the domain name system. So this is a broad, comprehensive privacy approach that Europe is taking that impacts a lot of different things. So it was not written to deal with the whois issue or the domain name system, which makes it a bit challenging because the scope of it and how it's going to actually be implemented is very unclear, I think, for a lot of parties that are impacted, not just in the domain name space, but I think in the United States broadly in other sectors. So the approach I believe that ICANN is taking and what I think got posted yesterday was that they've been continuing to coordinate with European data protection authorities. These are the actual government officials in each European member state that will actually be enforcing these rules to try to get some clarity as to whether or not this interim model, which I think is actually now called a cookbook, if I remember correctly, is sufficient to meet their needs. And I believe what was posted yesterday was they've continued to have good conversations. The data protection authorities are meeting April 10th and 11th, I believe, and ICANN is hoping to get April 12th and 13th some kind of written guidance as to whether or not the model that has been proposed is sufficient to meet those standards. And again, part of the challenge here is to develop rules and norms that will, pass muster with European regulators without understanding what the regulators want. And so it's very difficult. Registries and registrars, people that are in ICANN that are involved in the value chain of providing DNS services have to figure out a way to manage risk, and that's what the challenge is in this environment. I will say that the GAC has provided advice on the model, and there's a few changes that the GAC would like to have made in the model in terms of whether it's sufficient or not. So hearing from the DPAs will be particularly important. And we've made it pretty clear from NTI's perspective that yes, we appreciate the need and the fact that people want to respect European privacy law and ICANN and others that operate globally. But it's particularly important from our perspective that we maintain timely access for particular groups of stakeholders, including law enforcement, consumer protection, cybersecurity researchers who use this data to deal with botnets and other things, and then obviously also IP rights holders, and that's the tiered access system. So obviously this model is not going to be put in place by May 25th, so ICANN has also asked for a moratorium or regulatory forbearance so that the process can be put in place. That's kind of where I think things step now. It's also hard to figure out what an accreditation model looks like until you know what your solution set is. And so it's very difficult to talk about accreditation until you know what you're accrediting for.
So Milton, you seem to say that maybe this might be a good process if we can work out the accreditation system, but it's just not going to be done in time, or are there more fundamental problems?
There's more fundamental problems. The basic problem comes down to one word, and that is the purpose of whois. Purpose. ICANN has basically taken, in data protection law, the data that you can collect and that you can publish depends on the purpose of your collecting it. So, for example, if I'm running an R Street panel, and I'm asking you to sign up for our mailing list. That's the purpose for the data collection, and I can't then do something completely different with it, like send it to the police to scan for which one of you hasn't paid their parking tickets. ICANN has never decided what the purpose of whois is. De facto, many people in the community, when the thing started, thought that the purpose was to facilitate ICANN's technical coordination of the DNS, and that we need information about what the name servers are when you register, and we need some kind of a contact point for problems associated with the domain. What happened was that by default, ICANN published a lot of additional information simply because we were harking back to a time when we were dealing with computer scientists and research networks who wanted to have information about each other. And this very large amount of contact information, addresses, names, email addresses, and so on, was out there for more than 15 years, and people developed uses of it. And now, what ICANN's trying to do is retroactively say, well, all these people are using this data, and they really like having this data. Therefore, that's kind of the purpose of whois, is to keep all of these stakeholders happy with the data that they can get for free now. And that's, in fact, not the purpose of WHOIS. The purpose of WHOIS should be directly tied to ICANN's mission, which again is to coordinate and stabilize the DNS. And it's very clear that certain kinds of data don't need to be collected to do that. And it's even clearer that lots of the data doesn't need to be published to do that. So that's the fundamental debate right now. The basis of tiering is going to depend on how we define the purpose of who gets access to that data. One of the things we fear, most of the civil society activists, is that we will have tiering, but it will be just sort of an open gate that anybody who wants to can walk through it, and except any ordinary member of the public. So in some sense, this might be worse than it was before, because you'll have privileged classes who will basically be able to consume all the data they want and make extensive use of it, including commercial services that she's talking about, the so-called security services. And the ordinary person won't be able to get that data, which is probably not a big step forward.
Any of you have other comments?
Yeah, I would just say that, when NTI took a particularly strong position on the need to maintain access to this for the reasons that we've described, that is not a U.S.-only position. Our colleagues in Europe actually feel the same way, both in the member states and in the European Commission. So part of this, again, is getting clarity from the European data protection authorities and them talking to their own colleagues to make sure that we get these needs addressed. And again, I think this April 16th timeframe that's coming up will be particularly important to see where we are if we're ready to move forward.
I think that leads into the next question I wanted to ask, which is about, you're talking about this is about diplomatic alliances, and it's not just the U.S. on its own, especially at the ITU where you're dealing with other member states. It's important to have alliances and friends that you're going to push for similar policy issues for. I know in 2012, maybe the ITR that ended up getting passed, the U.S. is not okay with, but the fact that only 89 countries signed and a lot of countries joined the U.S. in not signing was considered a win by a lot of people, especially in the U.S. So have there been changes that you've seen, either, Larry, while you were at NTI since the wiki in 2012, or even in the current administration, have there been changes that any of you have noticed?
I'm not probably close enough to it to opine on the last year and a quarter, but I will say this, that I don't think anybody in the United States, at least in the delegation of the WICET, took that outcome as a win in 2012. In fact, as I said earlier, I think we took it as a wake-up call because I think it indicated the fact there was a lot of work and advocacy that needed to be done with countries in the developing world. And again, as I related earlier in this session, I did talk about how I believe that the work that was done from 2012 and to 2016 did a lot to bring a lot of those countries who had expressed concerns, or it shown more willingness to support a government-only control of the internet solution, brought them back into providing more support for multi-stakeholder approaches. And I think that was very much a focused effort by people in the United States government, State Department of Commerce to make that happen. And I think it, as I said before, I thought one of the best data points for that was the fact that you had 30 countries that had voted, to the extent you wanted to refer to the action at the WICET as indicating support for government control of the internet. 30, in effect, moved back and supported the outcome of the community's work to develop the IANA transition plan and defining the role of governments at ICANN. So I think that showed the level of progress that was made over the course of those 3 or 4 years after the WICET. In terms of what's happened since then, maybe Fiona has comments on that.
Yeah, for all of these meetings, it's important to build coalitions, and for the ITU, the group that we use for that is CTEL. It's the Inter-American Commission for Telecommunications, which is part of the Organization of American States. And I think they've meeting most recently was a couple of weeks ago. My calendar's got correct in my head. And we continue to work through that region and develop proposals. And I think there's a lot of synergies in our region, but also with Europe and some colleagues in Asia, again, about IT reform and governance and things like that. So I think those relationships continue to be strong. It's these policy issues that are going to pop up on the margins that are going to take up a big part of one or two particular committees, and we haven't seen the proposals yet to really know if there's been any shifts. I'm not seeing them in our Americas region, and I'm not seeing them with our European colleagues or our traditional partners. I think one of the harder issues is going to continue to be, does the developing world feel like its needs are being met? And one of the things they're going to really want to talk about is cost sharing for OTT, right? And how we're going to get through that conversation.
Just a question for Fiona about these OTT proposals. I'm interested in what kind of proposals you would anticipate, and how serious or feasible such a, if they want to recreate the accounting rate system, how can they do that?
So here's the thing about the ITU. In any meeting, facts aren't necessarily relevant to the proposal that's being put on the table. So I appreciate, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why you always sort of question whether the conversations are meaningful. People are going to have these real needs, and they're going to bring their proposals in, and they're going to be looking to have a conversation about, can you develop an accounting rate type of regime or something similar to that for OTT? They tried for 12 years on internet charging, the IK's debate, and you couldn't, right? But it doesn't mean it's not going to be talked about. It doesn't mean it's not going to be discussed. And it doesn't mean people aren't going to feel passionate about it and or be unhappy if they don't feel like there's some kind of resolution, even if there's a document that calls to do something that can't be done, right? And at that point, as the United States, you have to kind of have a conversation, and the delegation has to make choices. Are we going to take a reservation on something? Are we going to say no? Is there a way to study the issue to kind of figure out what the people's problems are? And again, as we see the proposals and as the delegation looks at them in the coming months, we'll kind of have those conversations.
So I wanted to ask, maybe each of you, if you want to answer, if you were ITU Secretary General or dictator of the ITU, inventing a new position there for a day, is there one thing that you think should change? Maybe you talk a lot about, when we see the proposals, should there be more transparency maybe with ITU proposals, or just any other change that you think would make a positive difference at the ITU?
So am I speaking as somebody who's trying to maximize the ITU, or somebody who's trying to position where the ITU can actually add value in this world?
You're speaking as yourself, so.
Well, I mean, my own sense is that the ITU performs a very important role in the radio spectrum area in terms of making sure that the spectrum that's being used worldwide is done in a logical and consistent basis. That's a very important function for the ITU, and it's something that we will need an ITU long in the future, being able to perform that. And if one were Secretary General of the ITU, I would certainly recommend to them they look at how do they make sure they do that job as well as they possibly can, and look for ways to bring improvements, innovations, and whatever to that a part of it. I think the other place where the ITU can play a role, but other people do as well, as in the development area. But I think there needs to be more work done to get focus around the types of projects that really can make a difference in building support for those sorts of projects in terms of what they're spending their time on. And frankly, if you had an ITU that performed both of those roles really, really well, I think a lot of people around the world would be very happy supporting an ITU that looked like that. So I'll leave it there.
And maybe just to add what Larry said, the one thing I think that could be improved in the ITU and in any institution is accountability. And this gets back to the development sector work. And, really, if resources are going to be spent, and if member states are going to make requests, actually understanding what those real requests are and having a path to actually meeting them and providing accountability in that construct would be a huge improvement, I think, in the institution.
I see the ITU intersecting with internet governance in a somewhat sidelong way, and in particular the WSIS forum and these WSIS-related holdover activities. I would just like to see the string pulled and the off button hit. And in particular, I view the ITU WSIS forums as an obvious and deliberate attempt to compete with the IGF. And I think I'd like to see the ITU stop doing that and let the internet governance discussions take place within the multi-stakeholder environment rather than within the ITU. And I would like to see, I hope we have seen maybe the end of the enhanced cooperation discussion. That's something that came to a non-conclusion, and I'm hoping that's over. And I think that if we really believe that the only thing the ITU does that's really important and useful is the radio sector, then why not just get rid of the other two sectors? Well, there's some need for some ITU standardization of telecom equipment, I guess, but I think the development sector is kind of, I'm not as, I mean, everybody would like to see somebody aid developing countries with their development, but this old model of an intergovernmental agency that doesn't control any capital and only raises money from other governments to fund its own operations is somehow going to create a broadband infrastructure in the world's developing countries is kind of an absurd thing. So all I see the development agency doing is sort of building up political support for the ITU as an agency and not really helping develop that much.
All right. With that, we'd like to shift to some audience questions. So if anyone has a question for any of the panelists. So the question, we don't know the mic, so I'll repeat. The question is about how increased UN influence over the internet would affect the rollout of IPv6.
So I'm not sure that what you described could happen anyway in terms of the UN taking over the internet first, but also I'm not sure even if it was able to, it would actually help with the adoption of IPv6. You know, the U.S. government through successive administrations has promoted the IPv6 deployment and tried to be a leader in that in terms of government services and government procurement. But I think the challenge for the deployment of it is getting industry and getting companies to actually deploy it through the value chain. Making decisions and investing in infrastructure, you know, happens, as I understand, in boardrooms in 6-month chunks, and it's hard to sometimes justify doing these kinds of upgrades and changes. So I think the question is, what's the incentive structure and how do you encourage people to move? I know that ICANN and ISOC and the RIRs have been doing some work to kind of encourage that, but it is definitely a space where more energy probably needs to be focused. I know in the OECD environment, we've done different things to encourage it and have included calls for IPv6 adoption in various ministerial statements and, you know, kind of giving it a governmental imprimatur, and it hasn't actually done anything in that regard.
Yes, again, if some of you don't know what IPv6 means, essentially it's a new internet protocol incompatible with the old one, which has a vastly expanded address space. And the main reason for creating it was that we are running out of globally unique IP addresses in the IPv4 space. And the problem with IPv6 adoption is essentially, some people have described it as a last mover's advantage. That is, wait for the rest of the world to convert, and then you do it and incur the expenses of doing so. But essentially, to convert to IPv6, you have to run both protocols at the same time. And that means that you still have to expand your v4 address space, so you're not solving the address problem in the short term by adopting v6. You are incurring additional expenses, and worst of all, there are various little, unexpected incompatibilities that you encounter when you make this migration. So you discover that, oh, that one device in my house doesn't really work with IPv6 because it's 5 years old. And, oh, that software we wrote for our enterprise 10 years ago has some embedded programs in it that assume we're dealing with IPv4. So it's kind of a time-consuming, ugly, and costly process to make the conversion. And we really have to have some kind of a big motivator to adopt it. Incidentally, I just came from China, which is, one of the worst in the world in terms of adopting V6. In fact, one of the Chinese officials told me, well, if we think we're falling behind the U.S. in IPv6, then China will suddenly go IPv6. But China has adopted a new national plan with the new party Congress, and the China Cyberspace Administration of China has taken over certain powers from the Ministry of Information and Information Technology that will put it in a position to push IPv6. But again, they're going to encounter all the same problems that have kept American companies from plunging headlong and uniformly into IPv6. So it's a really interesting question that's going to play out over the next 20 years or so, is how we actually make that transition.
Question about what we expect from OTT proposals at the.
Yeah, so I think it's important to say we haven't seen anything as of yet, because it's not that it's not transparent. They're just not submitted. They're all being developed by their national processes and being developed regionally. But the one thing that we have seen come in early through the African preparatory process was just a generic description from a country in Africa talking about a cost-sharing model for OTT. There wasn't more to it than a couple of lines. So again, I think it's early to say the specifics, but that's what I would anticipate based on what we've seen in past practice.
One more.
Well, the problem is that you can actually extend the life of v4 indefinitely if you're willing to live with network address translators, which, you know, many techies hate, but almost all companies and operations are actually doing. That's certainly what's going on in China. They are heavily natted, and they're not suffering from a shortage of addresses because of that. What IPv6 does is it makes the network transparent so that you can more easily deal with certain forms of applications that require large number of addressed objects like the Internet of Things. But it's not actually necessary to have that to implement an IP, to Internet of Things kind of a solution. Indeed, it's not always clear that people want or need global connectivity for some of these applications. They may want more of a private network.
All right. If no other questions, we can thank our panelists. Thank you all for coming. I think there's still cookies over there.